Welcome back everyone, Oz here, and today I've got some r/Traumatize Them Back for you all. As per usual, I'll be reading the post, giving you my opinions, and I hope you do the same down in the comments below. And without further ado, let's jump right into it. Familiar Philosophy 95. Lunch supervisor tried to inject my sister with insulin she didn't need. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at a pretty young age, 8. I'm actually really lucky that I was able to have such a good support system during my primary school years. All my teachers knew that I had diabetes, as well as the lunch ladies, and the lunch supervisors, and they never really treated me differently apart from being concerned for me sometimes. This actually concerns a lunch supervisor who me and my sister, suspect to be kinda racist, and happened a few months, around 5, after I got diagnosed. For context, we're black, and when we were younger, me and my sister, who I'll call B for clarity, were pretty much identical, despite the fact that she was a year younger than me. It got to a point that relatives used to remark that people could almost mistake us for twins. At school, this wasn't really such a problem because we used to act very differently. I was more introverted and very much into books, whilst she was a quintessential extrovert and was always more fierce. And for people who have seen us day in and day out, it was clear that we were different. Despite the fact that this supervisor knew us by name, by face, and could differentiate us, she would always act snide to us in a way that was uncomfortable. Our school was incredibly diverse with a minority of white people, and mostly Asians and black people, so I honestly don't know where this came from. Anyway, this supervisor knows that I take insulin for lunch, and that I'm going straight to the nurse once it's lunchtime. I was even allowed to leave early sometimes to get my dose. One day, she sees my sister playing on the playground before they call us for lunch. We were allowed to play for around 15 minutes before lunch, eat lunch, and then get 30 minutes to play again before classes started back up again. And I'm paraphrasing from my sister here. Grabbed my sister and started dragging her to the nurse. The nurse's office, in which I and my fellow diabetics would take our insulin, was around a 10-minute walk from the playground and quite close to both the lunch hall and the pastoral team. And the separate nurse's office for normal scrapes and stuff was really around 2 minutes from the playground. Despite the fact that my sister was crying out saying, "I'm not OP, I'm B, her sister," she apparently didn't believe her and marched her straight there. She gets to the nurse and sees she's not there. Of course she's not. She's at the normal one, and we've already taken our doses, and tries to force my sister to take insulin. Guys, this is incredibly dangerous for non-diabetics, and despite the fact that my sister was crying at this point, the supervisor didn't care. One of the pastoral team members heard her crying, goes to investigate, and comes to the scene. One look at my sister, and she asks my sister, "B, are you okay? What's happened?" My sister tells me that the supervisor just went pale, like all the blood drained from her face. Then she goes red, and as my sister is explaining, tries to butt in and say, "Well, she didn't say she was B. How was I supposed to know? I thought she was OP." Yeah, that didn't really fly well. Edit, I'm sorry about the inconclusiveness of the story. I forgot to add it in, probably because she didn't get fired. I remember seeing her in year 6, so 3 years after I was diagnosed. I'm pretty sure she got suspended, not fired, and she had to go through rigorous first aid training, as well as being sent, I think that's the word, to the board of directors of which our head mistress was on. I absolutely agree that she should have gotten fired, but she was one of those who'd been there forever. Just because she was there for a long time and was friendly with people doesn't mean that she shouldn't have gotten fired. I remember an incident report was sent to our parents, and even with my sister telling them what happened, I wasn't there obviously, my parents tried to raise a huge stink. They're first-gen immigrants though, and I guess it wasn't taken as seriously because of that. So, I've been pretty much stun-locked trying to figure out how a circumstance like this can happen beyond just having zero faith in children and not believing them and thinking that she was simply lying and trying to get out of her diabetic shock in order to continue playing on the equipment. So she thought that she would save the day by dragging her to the nurse's office despite her pleas that she's not OP, in fact is her sister. I can certainly connect the dots of how this could definitely have some racial motivation attached to it, but also, I'm so pale I get moonburn, so I don't think I can really actually relate to this. And for those of you who can relate to this, what do y'all think? Do you guys think there could be a racial aspect to this, or do you think that maybe she just doesn't believe children in general, or what's your general thought and consensus for those of you who have actually experienced this in your life and can give some proper input beyond a pale motherfucker who's pastier than a goddamn tube of toothpaste. Whole kitchen, 3328. Roommate kept using my makeup without asking, so I made sure she'd never do it again. I shared an apartment with a girl who had no concept of boundaries. She constantly borrowed my stuff without asking. Clothes, shoes, and the worst of all, my makeup. I told her countless times to stop, but she always brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal. Well, the last straw came when I found out that she had used my expensive foundation for a party and didn't even bother cleaning the bottle. That's when I decided it was time to teach her a lesson. I went out and bought a cheap, old foundation from the dollar store and swapped it with mine, adding a bit of self-tanner to the mix. I left it in plain sight on my vanity and waited. Sure enough, the next weekend, she waltzed out of the bathroom with an orange face. I didn't say a word as she headed off to her party. The next day, she came home furious, complaining that people had been laughing at her all night, and I just smiled and said, "Oh no, maybe it wasn't your shade." She didn't touch my stuff again after that. So what kind of shenanigans can actually happen if someone were to borrow your makeup and leave it open, or perhaps using it without properly cleaning makeup brushes? I feel like there could be a potential biological contamination or makeup being ruined by being left open and exposed to air for long periods of time. Like, I feel like it's already frustrating enough to find out that your roommate's using your makeup, and I know makeup isn't cheap in the slightest, especially if you have like a limited edition makeup palette or something like that. But then to find out they're not properly even taking care of it on top of that, that feels like that'd be incredibly fucking frustrating. Also, is it common sense to not touch someone else's makeup, or is it common practice to share makeup? That is a genuine question on my end, because I know that my stepmother used to be a big user of the website Makeup Alley, where she would exchange makeup products with other people and that kind of stuff. So I know that kind of practice exists, but that was also a consensual practice where they actively chose to do that and sought people out who were willing to do that, compared to this, where this is just a roommate bumming their other roommate's makeup off and using it without express permission. Smith Angel 0, micromanaging me. A few years ago, I worked at an office where my manager was the king of micromanagement. Steve would hover over everyone's shoulders, recheck every email we sent, and send follow-ups with friendly reminders for tasks that weren't even due yet. One day, I'm working on a project we were all assigned, a detailed report for a quarterly review. I'm making steady progress, but Steve decides to help. And by help, I mean he sits next to me and dictates every little thing. From font choice to phrasing, he even made me reread a paragraph 5 times because he didn't like how it felt. I finally finished the report, but before I can even save it, Steve takes the file and sends it directly to the higher-ups. Doesn't review it, doesn't double-check, just sends it off with his name in the subject line. Fast forward to the meeting later that week. The head of our department starts going over the report and points out an embarrassing mistake. Steve had somehow changed the revenue numbers while hovering over me. The mistake made it look like we lost a lot of money. The room goes dead silent. Steve's face turns beet red as the boss asks, "Who submitted this?" Steve tries to deflect, but I casually raise my hand and say, "Steve submitted it," but he insisted on reviewing every detail himself. I was just following his directions. The boss doesn't say anything, but looks directly at Steve for a long moment before moving on. After that, Steve stopped micromanaging me entirely. In fact, he avoided assigning me anything directly for weeks. Best day of my career so far. So when I was younger and first put into a position of management, I did fall into the micromanagement trap, and I felt like I had a new responsibility, and because my old responsibilities were suddenly gone, I needed to be very micromanagey on every detail because I was trying to fill a new void that was in my work, and honestly, looking back on it, I was probably pretty fucking annoying and got in the way of things a lot. And my guess would be is a lot of people who probably enter management roles probably feel the same kind of pressure where they suddenly feel like they need to earn that management position and begin to overmanage and micromanage the people below them. And because I never really found a direct solution for it, for those of you who are in managing positions, what kind of solutions did you find to avoid yourself from micromanaging? And did you ever have a problem like that, where when you were thrust into the responsibilities of it, you kind of felt this sudden urge to be very involved with every little detail to justify your position? Or did you just never have that problem and were simply built different? Because who knows, there might be someone in my audience who could really use that kind of advice, and I think honestly that could help lead a very constructive conversation to help prevent Steves in the future. Because most people don't mean to be like Steve. Steve is probably a very special case. So, for any industry vets who are willing to give any kind of advice, that would be greatly appreciated. Dear Johnny HD, my father accused me of not being sick while I had a heart attack. Back in 2017, when I was just 17, I had a heart attack. It happened on Christmas Eve of all days. Instead of getting support from my family, my father accused me of making this whole thing up for attention, despite the fact that I hate attention at family gatherings. I was rushed to our local hospital, and things were so serious that they had to transfer me by ambulance to a larger hospital in the city because they couldn't treat me locally. You'd think that would have been proof enough that this wasn't some ploy for attention, but no. I ended up needing surgery and went through a tough 2-month recovery period. It was one of the most physically and emotionally challenging times of my life. Through all of that, my father never once visited me in the hospital. He was too scared and ashamed to show up, and he's never apologized for how he treated me during one of the worst moments of my life. To this day, we don't speak. I've cut him out of my life because I realized I deserve better than a parent who accused me of faking a life-threatening medical emergency. So I can somewhat understand a parent's hesitation to not initially believe a child, because they could be faking an illness for attention or to get out of school. I mean, hell, I know I did it a lot when I was younger. I used to crumple up granola bars and put them in the toilet and be like, oh look, I threw up, can I stay home from school today? But then eventually this backfired on me and I started actually throwing up in the toilet, and it turns out I had severe stomach ulcers. But that's a totally different story for another time when I was 9. But still, kids will do things to get out of school and to fake illnesses. Let's not pretend like this doesn't happen. Even if you never did as a child, there's still going to be one who does. But it's one thing to be skeptical of a child who's trying to get out of school versus a 17-year-old who's having heart complications at a family gathering. Those are two drastically different situations and scenarios. And, I mean, hell, one doesn't even have their brain fully developed. I mean, yes, the 17-year-old doesn't have their frontal lobe fully developed or connected yet, but it is far more developed than your average 7-year-old. So for the father to be this dismissive, and then when he finds out that it actually was something serious, and to never once even try to apologize or make amends or even visit during the complications in the months of hell that OP went through, that's fucked up. And this is a circumstance where going no contact is entirely understandable. I would still say leave lines open in case your father ever does want to actually apologize. Actually, wait, OP is my age. Father hasn't apologized in 8 years. I don't think he ever will. So perhaps in this situation, just simply never accepting an apology is actually justified. I mean, he had his window to apologize. And if his pride means more than the relationship with their child, that's just sad. So let this be a soft lesson to everyone listening. If you were wrong about something and it was something serious and your pride is getting in the way of you apologizing for admitting that mistake, don't let a relationship rot just because you're afraid to admit you were wrong. Osaka motherfucker. I got an obnoxious passenger fired. This is a long one, but it was the best revenge story of my life so far. I'm a South African living in Japan, so I took my Japanese wife to meet my parents and have a honeymoon in South Africa. On the first of 3 flights back to Japan was from Johannesburg to Qatar. We take our seats and get settled in. I noticed that a lot of passengers around us are wearing the same t-shirts, some kind of pharmaceutical company. As soon as we got settled in, I noticed that the women and 2 men sat behind us were also employees of this company. As soon as they got settled in, I noticed she, let's call her Brandy, was quite chatty, loud, and a bit obnoxious. But I'm a nervous flyer, so at the same time, I was more worried about the takeoff than her. So I put my earpods in and whoosh! We take off for our 8-hour flight to Qatar. As soon as the seatbelt sign switched off, Brandy started ordering brandy and cokes for herself and her 2 coworkers. As each drink came, Brandy's voice got louder and more obnoxious. After drink number 6, the topic of her conversation turns to relationships. By this time, half the cabin could hear their conversation about how she disapproves of interracial relationships. Even I could hear her through the guttural screams and face-melting guitar riffs of Miss Sugar blasting through my earpods. Then it happened. A nice woman on 4 seats to her left quite loudly says, "Ma'am, could you please quiet down? You're a bit loud and I'm trying to get some sleep." I heard it too, so paused the song and took out my left earpod to excitedly eavesdrop. Brandy was not happy. She says, "Excuse me, this isn't a nighttime flight. Haven't you heard of earplugs?" And then just jumped straight back into her conversation. The tension in the air immediately changed. In that moment, all the people who heard the interaction caught eyes with each other, and we all knew this flight was about to get interesting. About 20 minutes later, a flight attendant comes and politely asks Brandy to quiet down a bit. She begrudgingly agrees, orders another round, and quiets down. But it only takes Brandy about 30 minutes to get all the way back up to a volume louder than the jet engines roaring outside the windows. Then, another Chinese woman from the other side of the cabin gets up and walks to where Brandy is sitting, and in her best attempt at English says, "Please be quiet. My child keeps waking up because of you." Brandy looks up and, I shit you not, asks this Chinese woman in a very mispronounced Chinese, "Can you speak Chinese?" I'm fluent in Chinese, so I could understand what she was trying to say, and just kept repeating it until the frustrated Chinese woman went back to her seat. By this time, both flight attendants for our cabin were very much aware of Brandy's sassy nature and decided to close the bar off for the whole cabin, which pissed me off because I was hoping to enjoy a few more whiskeys before we landed. A few minutes later, I hear the sound of shuffling, then plastic, and then the faint sound of what sounds like the cap of a glass bottle being cracked open. Then the sound of liquor being poured into cups. Yup! Brandy had opened her bottle of duty-free brandy she bought at the airport. And, once again, their conversation began to crescendo. Now, the whole time I had been spectating the Brandy situation, I wasn't really paying attention to my wife, who I assumed was sleeping next to me. I then saw my wife pull one of her earpods out, turn to try and get a look at Brandy through the crack in the seat, and then turn to look at me with a face I rarely see my wife make. It was a face of pure rage and frustration. I snapped. Now, usually, I'm not the kind of person who likes to cause a scene, but I decided that I'm not going to let this asshole of a woman ruin my wife's flight. So, like a crazy person, I stood up and announced loud enough that the entire cabin turned to hear me, "Excuse me, everybody, can I please have all your attention? By the show of hands, who of you would like these people to shut the fuck up?" About 30 passengers all around us raised their hands. I then turned to Brandy and just point and say, "Look, understand? Shut up." I sat back down to the sound of applause from all the passengers that were raising their hands. My wife was shocked that I did that, but I told her that I did it because I could see that Brandy was beginning to bother you too. She gave me a hug and the flight attendant saw what I did and brought me a cup of Coke, but slipped me 2 of those little bottles of whiskey. Thankfully, Brandy and the gang then passed out and were quiet for the rest of the flight. So my wife and I could relax. But Brandy wasn't finished. And now she had a new target. Me. On our descent, Brandy awakes and decides that she wants to place some cards on the entertainment screen attached to the back of my seat, trying her best to hit the buttons hard enough to make my seat move. I teach kids for a living, so I know that she is behaving like an angry toddler trying to get a rise out of me. So I ignore her. We land, the plane taxis off the runway, and everyone starts getting up to get off the plane. As soon as I get up and she sees my wife and I, she starts repeatedly insulting me about my weight and how I married an Asian woman because I can't get with a real South African woman and blah blah blah. High school bully level bullshit. I just smile and nod my head at everything she was saying and exit the plane. Finally, Brandy and her coworkers walk off and my wife and I find a nice cafe to have a coffee and chill my stretch for a bit before we make our way to the next boarding gate for our second flight to Malaysia. We eventually get to the gate and, lo and behold, guess who's also flying to Malaysia? That's right, it's Brandy. She's standing by the gate window taking selfies and doesn't notice me. I find an empty seat next to a guy wearing the same pharmaceutical company t-shirt and say, "Excuse me, sir, that woman over there with blonde hair taking a selfie, what's her name?" He asks me why, and I say that she looks like someone I used to go to high school with, but I wasn't sure and didn't want to make an ass of myself by asking her directly. He tells me, and I say, "Oh, then that's not her, sorry." I thank him, and for the remainder of the way to the gate, logged onto the airport Wi-Fi, found their company's Facebook page and website, and sent a detailed recount of Brandy's behavior, being sure to include all the colorful things she was talking about with her coworkers. The next 2 flights back to Japan were uneventful and got home safe and sound. 2 weeks later, I get a reply from the CEO asking me for my number as he would like to talk to me about what happened. He calls me and profusely apologizes for what Brandy put us through. Turns out that by the time that Brandy had landed in Malaysia, the CEO had seen my message, changed her return flight back to South Africa the very next day, and fired her at arrivals in the Johannesburg airport when she got back. I bought a bottle of brandy and coke on my way home from work that day to celebrate with my lovely wife. Now, there certainly might be a little bit of embellishment in this story, but honestly, that's pretty common with these. Honestly, let this be a reminder to anyone who's wearing a company t-shirt to remember that all of your actions are a direct representation of your company, and everything you do or say is a direct reflection. So it's always best when you're wearing your company's merch to be on your best behavior. This is also the same reason why I can't be toxic in Marvel Rivals, because my name is Oz Media. So if I'm yelling at people, then suddenly everyone's going, oh damn, Oz is a fucking asshole in Marvel Rivals. So I'm always on my best behavior and in fact being positive to the point of being toxic. Oh, but sometimes someone's toxic first and I get to swing back, and God, I live for those moments. For those of you wondering, Marvel Rivals is a competitive shooter that's online where you play against other players and you play as Marvel heroes, and it's actually pretty good for being a Marvel tie-in game. Shockingly so, actually. And because I know a lot of you are probably gonna ask, I'm a filthy Penny Parker main. I'm rank lord with her. I don't want to talk too much about that because it's actually kind of embarrassing. Downtown Bag 8008. Mobile phone company won't stop pushing a plan, so I decided to traumatize him. I actually had my first ever traumatize them back situation the other day. Never expected it, and I'm very excited to share. For context, I was recently diagnosed with a terminal brain disease with an average 4 to 5 year life expectancy, with a small percent in the 10 to 20 year. I've only known for a few months. I'm still very ignorant about it, and I'm still raw and probably quite unstable. I intend to be in the 30 to 40 year category. I don't often bring it up or reference it unless relevant to the situation. All of that is to say, this is not typical behavior for me. But it was too irresistible. I have a new mobile carrier, and when the first full bill showed up, it was almost $40 more per month than what was promised by the agent who sold me the plan set. So I'm on the phone with a rep to help me fix the issue. He reviews my account and sees several things increasing my bill, one of which is a monthly $10 fee allowing me to upgrade to the newest phone every 2 years. I have no desire to be a part of this program, so I told him to remove it. I'm thinking, there's 25% of the problem gone. However, the customer service rep thinks it's a bad move for me to drop that perk. He tells me that if I drop the option, I cannot get back on the program. That's fine. I don't want to be on the program. Please remove me. But you really want to keep it because 2 years of $10 a month is only $240. The latest phone is always more expensive than that. That's okay. I'm not concerned about having the latest phone. Please remove me. 2 more times he tried to push me into keeping the plan. I finally got fed up and decided to traumatize him. Since you don't seem to be hearing me, I'm going to be extremely blunt with you. I was recently diagnosed with a terminal brain disease and I have 4 years to live. I don't give a shit about upgrading to the latest and greatest phone. I'd only be able to do it once anyway. And he dropped me from the plan. I know that some customer service reps are almost like contractually required to try to prevent people from leaving plans, and they also may or may not have commission sales tied to it. So there are times where I can understand why they might be so pushy, but fuck, it is annoying. No one likes being pushed into something and feeling like they have to essentially bend over and curtail to what the salesperson is selling so they can just get off the phone. And like, there are times where I feel bad because you're just trying to make ends meet and, you know, your contract probably says you have to do this. And I feel like that a lot of people probably don't like actually being in this position as a customer service rep. But who knows, maybe some of them actually revel and enjoy doing this. For those who have previously been customer service reps, what's the 411 on this? I'd actually be really curious to read some comments and get an insight on this. Like, is haggling with customers like this part of your job, or is it like a specific kind of customer service rep who's an asshole that fits this kind of bill here? Because I also know that not all customer service reps are bad people. I mean, yeah, it can be annoying, but you have a job you're trying to do, and I get and understand that. Probably just bitchin'. The time I vomited blood during a work meeting. So this happened over 5 years ago, but I was thinking about it today. My pregnancy with my daughter was incredibly unexpected. My husband and I, 25 at the time, had been told by our doctor that we were both medically infertile, low sperm count and PCOS respectively. We were given fertility medication to start with, as further procedures would not be given the green light until the initial options had been exhausted, and we were told that we were looking at about 5 years until the ball was really rolling. Well, we got pregnant with our daughter, the first month on the medication. Surprise! While unexpected, she was very wanted, and we were over the moon. Except my husband was unemployed at the time, and I was working as a high school teacher with pretty rough kids. My pregnancy was also awful. I spotted constantly, had dizzy spells, and had hyperemesis gravidarum from 8 weeks until my daughter was born. I was throwing up about 10 times a day, was hospitalized for dehydration 5 times, and lost 18 kilograms, 40 pounds for my American audience, over the course of my pregnancy. Fun times. In my department were 4 other teachers, Karens 1 through 3, and Pete, the sweetest boomer you ever met. The Karens were by the books what you would find in Australian public education. Catty, calcified, and bigoted. I called in sick at least once a week because of my rough pregnancy, and they were constantly making nasty comments about it, both to my face and other departments, despite the fact that none of my work was ever left for them to do. It affected my professional life quite badly, and I often thought of quitting, despite having no real option to do so. Cue the trauma. The Karens insisted on weekly after-school departmental meetings that lasted several hours, despite never covering more than a post-it note worth of info. I had missed several, and the Alpha Karen demanded I come to the next one, sitting in a stuffy room while the Karens went over the latest Home and Away episode. I felt a wave of nausea. I stood and excused myself, but Alpha moved to block the door, saying that I could hold whatever it was for a minute while we sorted out a detail in a planning document. I asked Pete to pass me the bin at his feet, which he did, eagerly, and I projectile vomited. Blood. See, the constant spewing had irritated my throat enough that it bled every time I was sick. My doctor knew about it, and honestly, it looked a lot worse than it was. The Karens stood in silent horror as the pale, gone-pregnant woman threw up blood in a bin, and Pete let out a piercing scream. He shouted at them to call an ambulance, but I waved them off, saying that this happens to me all the time. After the dry retching stopped, I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, smearing blood everywhere, and asked if they still needed help with a document. They demurred, and I grabbed my things and left. The Karens never bullied me again, and instead only spoke to me in the softest of voices for the rest of the year, as if I were dying. Glorious. So, my understanding, and please for the love of God correct me if I'm wrong, a pregnancy can go just a multitude of different directions. You can either have the easiest possible pregnancy where, honestly, it really doesn't affect your day-to-day life, or you could have one that pretty much makes your day-to-day life hell, and everyone's personal experiences can vary so goddamn wildly, it's honestly, at least in my opinion, not fair to compare two women's pregnancies to one another. And the reason why I say this, despite the fact that I'm probably one of the least qualified people to talk about this, is that I do wonder if the Karens in this story, if one of them had their own child and they got lucky and had a fairly quote-unquote easy pregnancy, and when I say easy, I mean easy by comparison, but they thought that she was either overreacting or causing a scene or using it to get her to work and may have been annoyed with that, using their own experiences as a candidate for comparison when, honestly, I don't think that's quite fair in a situation like this because it can be so wildly different, as I was saying. And yeah, she got put in her place. Honestly, it'd be pretty horrific to see a pregnant woman throw up blood because honestly, as probably poor Pete did, probably assumed the absolute worst. But thankfully, by the sounds of it, it sounds that OP did actually end up having her daughter, and hopefully things have been smooth since what sounds to be a pretty god-awful pregnancy. Part of me wants to ask what kind of experiences people have had with others when it comes to them being pregnant and what kind of discrimination or treatment they have gotten, but the other half of me doesn't want to know because it would break my heart and I feel like I'd probably really just hate it and feel horrible. So, yeah. Jabulia. Woman won't stop fishing for information at a traffic collision and is then traumatized by the information she was fishing for. Content warning for death. I'm a police officer. A few years ago, I was stationed on the perimeter of a fatal traffic collision. Essentially, what happened was a dude was driving recklessly in a stolen vehicle, ended up going off-road, unintentionally, and rolled several times, was ejected, no seatbelt, and died. Car was upside down in a field adjacent to the road, and body was lying in the field about 200 feet away, covered up by a yellow tarp while we waited for the medical examiner to arrive. We closed the roadway near the field and had it blocked for traffic in both directions. Naturally, people had to be turned around and rerouted/detoured. Many were annoyed, but most people saw the condition of the vehicle and the number of police cars and went on with their day. One woman in particular just would not move along. Rubberneckers are common, and it's normal for people to try and fish for information, but this woman was relentless, and after several minutes of us politely deflecting her questions, she said, "Well, thank God everyone was okay." I just stared at her for a second and replied, "They weren't okay." She looked at me and was like, "What? They weren't?" While once again looking around me, trying to see into the field. I said, "No, actually, they died." Right about then, she noticed the yellow tarp and put two and two together. She gasped, covered her mouth in shock, began tearing up and breathing quickly, before finally going back to her vehicle where she had a mini meltdown and then left after taking like 15 minutes to calm down. If she had just turned around and went on her way, she never would have known the difference. But she just had to know. Massive, massive content warning for what I'm about to say here, because it does involve a very tragic death. The worst accident that I have ever bore witness to happened while I was driving with my mother to the airport while I was visiting home for Christmas in Idaho. The roads were slick, it was foggy, and things were definitely not safe. And on the way there, passing by the freeway, one side was entirely closed off, and as we passed by, we found out why. There were the charred remains of a car parked underneath a semi. We later came to learn that someone was driving the wrong way on the freeway, having taken an exit ramp as an on-ramp, not realizing they were getting onto the wrong side of the freeway due to the fog. Because of this, they hit a semi front-on and could not get out of the car. And unfortunately, I'm also very aware that what I saw in the car was in fact someone's remains, and they hadn't quite gotten to the point where they were able to pull the remains out after putting the fire out. And I know that's an incredibly grim story to tell, but while you're driving to the airport, and if the road conditions aren't good, please take the extra 5 minutes to make sure you get there safely. That's all I can really ask.
Hey, welcome to the outro. Don't forget this whole thing is basically brought to you by GamerSupps. If you like caffeine, then I can't recommend GamerSupps enough. Use code OZ at checkout to support the channel. And I do actually use this product. It's replaced all other sources of caffeine for me because I feel good. It doesn't have any of that extra stuff that a pre-workout blend might have. It's with a couple of the extra things to make it so you don't crash as hard. It's good. I like it. Personally, if you really want a good flavor, try the Soda Pressing Pear or even the Dragon Fruit Punch. Those two are my personal favorites right now.